There is a book that was removed from the Bible, not because it was false, not because it contradicted Scripture, but because what it revealed was too much, too detailed, too dangerous, too close to things we were never supposed to understand. And for over 2,000 years it stayed hidden, buried in the Ethiopian highlands, preserved by a church most of the world forgot existed, the Book of Enoch. And what it says about where evil came from, about who really walks among us, about what happened before the flood, will permanently change the way you read everything else. Stay here. This is the part they left out. Before we go any further, if this kind of content keeps you up at night in the best possible way, hit like right now and subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more coming, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Most people have been taught a version of spiritual history that is clean, organized, easy to swallow. God made everything, man sinned, Jesus came, the end. But that version skips over something massive, something that sits right there in Genesis chapter 6 in plain sight in less than 10 verses, almost like whoever wrote it didn't want you to look too long. It says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they came down, and from that union giants were born, mighty men, men of renown." And then almost immediately after, the flood, as if someone needed to erase what had just happened. That's it. That's all the Bible gives you, 10 verses, and then it moves on. But the Book of Enoch doesn't move on. The Book of Enoch goes all the way in. Here's what almost no one talks about. The people who wrote the New Testament knew this book. They had read it. It's quoted directly in the letter of Jude, one of the books that made it into the Bible. Which means the early Christians weren't keeping this at a distance. They were reading it, studying it, taking it seriously. So the question isn't whether this book matters. The question is why somewhere along the way someone decided you shouldn't read it. Think about that for a moment. There are things in this book that were considered important enough for the writers of the New Testament to reference, and yet the book itself was left out. What does that tell you about the selection process? What does that tell you about what was allowed and what wasn't? Most people stop asking questions like that, and that's exactly why most people never find the answers. But here's what the Book of Enoch actually describes. 200 beings, called the Watchers, descended to a mountain called Hermon. They took an oath together, they made a pact, and then they came down to earth and did something that contaminated the human bloodline so severely that God decided the only solution was to drown the entire planet and start over. These weren't minor spiritual disturbances. The Book of Enoch describes beings of enormous power teaching humanity things it was never supposed to know. Metalworking, the forging of weapons, the cutting of roots and herbs, what we would today call herbalism or pharmacology. The reading of the stars, astrology, the art of enchantments, and one more that seems almost absurd until you sit with it, cosmetics, the art of beautifying the face, of creating illusions of appearance. Why would that be in the same list as weapons and dark knowledge? Why would something as ordinary as makeup be placed alongside sorcery and war? Because the principle is the same. Every item on that list is a tool for deception, for making something appear to be what it is not. Weapons give an illusion of power, astrology gives an illusion of control, and cosmetics give an illusion of form. They all distort reality.
and that, according to the Book of Enoch, was the curriculum of the Watchers.
Now we arrive at something that will make you uncomfortable, and it should. The offspring of the Watchers and human women were the Nephilim, giants, not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically enormous beings that, according to the text, began consuming humanity. They devoured livestock, then they devoured people. They filled the earth with violence and blood. And the human beings living in that time, completely unprepared, completely outmatched, cried out to heaven in terror. 4 archangels heard them: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel. And they brought the report to God, and God's response was the flood. But here is the part that most people never reach. Here is the part that changes everything. The flood killed the Nephilim. Their physical bodies died. But the Book of Enoch says something that the Bible barely touches on, that their spirits did not die with their bodies, that the spirits of the giants, separated from flesh, became something else, something that wanders, something that cannot rest, something that seeks embodiment in whatever it can find. This, according to the Book of Enoch, is the origin of demons. Not fallen angels, not rebellious spiritual beings with their own bodies and their own agenda. Demons in this framework are the disembodied souls of dead giants, hybrid creatures, half divine and half human, that died in the flood but could not fully pass on, because their nature had no proper place in either world, too corrupted to return to the divine, too spiritual to simply decompose with their flesh. And the Book of Jubilees, a companion text from the same tradition, goes even further. It says that after the flood, when humanity began sinning again, an angel named Mastema approached God with a problem. He was responsible for punishing human wickedness, but there was too much of it. He couldn't manage alone. So he asked God for help, and God gave him 10% of the spirits of the Nephilim to serve as his agents. Read that again. 10% of the souls of the drowned giants were assigned by God to work as instruments of punishment against human beings. That is not the version of spiritual warfare you were taught in Sunday school. That is something older, something rawer, something that doesn't clean up the edges or make the story comfortable for children. And this is where I need you to stay with me, because what comes next is the part almost no one has the patience to reach. If demons are the spirits of the Nephilim, then they are not purely evil in the way we typically imagine evil. They are broken, displaced, caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. They are, in a word, lost. And when you understand that, when you stop seeing the demonic as something purely external and alien, and start seeing it as something that reflects a distortion of what was meant to be whole, something shifts in how you read every spiritual confrontation in Scripture. Every exorcism, every moment of possession, every time a human being is described as being under the influence of something they cannot fully explain or control, all of it starts to look different through this lens, not as an invasion from outside, but as the presence of something that should have been resolved long ago, still unresolved, still searching.
There is a concept buried in the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient manuscripts discovered in the caves of Qumran in 1947, one of the most significant archaeological finds in history, called the 3 Nets of Belial. 3 traps, 3 entry points through which corruption enters a human life. The first is deception and dishonesty toward others. The second is sexual immorality. The third is the love of money and material wealth. And the texts warn that once a person falls into one of these nets, the pull toward the others increases dramatically. It's not a linear path, it's a web. That warning is more than 2,000 years old, and it describes with extraordinary precision the exact patterns that modern psychology identifies in people who lose themselves, in compulsion, in self-destruction, in choices that make no rational sense but feel completely inevitable from the inside.
The ancient writers weren't ignorant. They were watching the same human nature you and I carry, and they were mapping it with the tools they had, tools that looked different from ours but were pointing at the same territory. Now stop for a moment. If any of this has unsettled you, good. That unsettlement is information. It means something in you is recognizing something true even before your conscious mind has processed it fully. Don't dismiss that feeling. Sit with it. If you've made it this far and this content is doing something to you, subscribe before you forget and leave a like. It helps more people find these conversations, more people who are asking the same questions you are. Here is the thing about the Book of Enoch that I keep returning to. It was not written as horror. It was not written to frighten people or to create a mythology of evil for its own sake. It was written as an explanation, as an answer to a question that every human being in every era has asked. Why is the world like this? Why is there so much violence, so much confusion, so much suffering that seems to have no origin and no resolution? And the answer the Book of Enoch gives is not because people are weak. It is not because sin entered through one man. It is something more specific and more disturbing than that. It is that at a certain point in history, something from outside entered and corrupted the system from the inside, and the effects of that corruption did not end with the flood. They continued. They were distributed. They were assigned roles and given agency, and they have been operating ever since. You don't have to believe this literally to feel the weight of it, because whether you interpret the Watchers as literal interdimensional beings or as a metaphor for systems of power that corrupt and exploit, the pattern is identical. Knowledge that was meant to serve life turned into a weapon. Strength that was meant to protect turned into domination. Beauty that was meant to reflect truth turned into an instrument of deception. That pattern is not ancient history. That pattern is today. And here is the key that the Book of Enoch quietly offers, not as a doctrine, not as a rule, but as an observation. The Watchers fell not because they were evil to begin with. They fell because they wanted something that was not theirs to take. They saw, they desired, they acted, and in doing so they passed a nature to their offspring, a nature that could not be satisfied, that always needed more, that consumed because it did not know how to simply be. That is the spiritual inheritance that the flood was meant to end. And yet, here we are.
The question is not whether you believe in giants or fallen angels or demonic hierarchies. The question is whether you recognize the pattern, whether you see it in the world, whether you see it in yourself, the insatiable hunger, the tendency to consume what should be cherished, the way certain forms of knowledge seem to corrupt rather than liberate. Enoch saw it. He walked with God for 365 years and then was taken, not dead, taken. The only man in the genealogy of Genesis chapter 5 who did not die. And before he was taken, he wrote. He recorded what he had been shown. He put into words a vision of the cosmos that was too large, too uncomfortable, too complete for the canon that came after him. And for centuries it sat in the highlands of Ethiopia, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, read by their priests, considered sacred, while the rest of the world moved on and forgot. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce carried 3 copies of the Book of Enoch out of Ethiopia and back to Europe, and the world of biblical scholarship was never quite the same again. Because what he brought back was not myth, it was not fantasy. It was a coherent, detailed, ancient account of events that the Bible references but never fully explains. And it fit. Not perfectly, not without tension, but it fit in a way that made scholars deeply uncomfortable because it raised the question they were not prepared to answer. What else was left out, and why?
That question is still open. It will remain open for as long as human beings are willing to sit with discomfort instead of reaching for easy resolution. Enoch was not a prophet in the conventional sense. He didn't stand in a city square and warn people of coming judgment. He walked, he observed. He was taken through levels of the cosmos that no other human in Scripture is described as accessing. He saw the prison where the watchers were held. He saw the structure of heaven. He saw the coming of a figure he called the Son of Man, a figure that would bring final judgment and final restoration. The early Christians recognized that figure, and they pointed back to Enoch as part of the chain of revelation that led to him. Everything you have heard tonight is ancient. The ideas are old, the questions are old, but they remain unanswered in the way that only the deepest questions remain unanswered. Not because no one has looked, but because the answer, when you get close to it, reveals something about the nature of the world that is very difficult to live with comfortably. The world is not clean. It never was. The story did not begin with a garden and a simple choice. Beneath that story is another story, older, stranger, and far more unsettling. And beneath that one, another still. Enoch walked into those depths. He came back changed, and then he was gone. The question the Book of Enoch leaves you with is not theological, it is personal. If the world is the way it is, not by accident, not by the simple weakness of human nature, but because something entered and deliberately corrupted what was meant to be whole, what does that change about how you move through it? What does it change about what you protect, what you consume, what you allow to influence you? That question doesn't need an institution to answer it. It doesn't need a doctrine. It needs you, alone, honest, willing to sit with what you actually see when you look at the world without the comfortable filter of what you were told it was. Enoch saw. He wrote. He was gone. What will you do with what you've seen tonight?